Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Dave Adamson. I work for the British Standards Institution. I'm based in London, and I'd like to thank you and welcome you to this webinar on purpose-driven organizations. I am going to be joined later, very soon actually, by my colleagues Ruth Wilkinson, Sarah Gillard, and Ben Kellard. They'll introduce themselves in due course. But I'm going to talk. I'll be talking you through the housekeeping and also a few slides of my own before that panel discussion takes place. You can see here it's already projected that this is a listen-only webinar, but do encourage you please to submit your questions that you see at the bottom right hand of your screen, and these will be given to the panelists and myself during the course of this 1-hour presentation. For any technical issues, do use the same box. And do look at the chat box. There might be some updates there. And upon completion of the webinar, if you could please do the feedback survey, then they'll send you a link to the webinar recording. Next slide, please. So you see the agenda. As I say, it's 1 hour. We'll be keeping to time. I've got just 10 minutes. We then turn it over to the panelists. And then we got a little bit of time for Q&A. We might build that into the panelist discussion, so it's not such a strict cutoff there at 11:40. They might carry on, and then we'll have the close of the webinar. Next slide, please. So as I say, I'm Dave Adamson. BSI has a couple of offices, one in Milton Keynes, one in Covent Gardens, and I'm working in the London office myself. And next slide, please. BSI, this is a little bit about BSI. You talk a lot about standardization, many webinars on standardization, but briefly to say that BSI is the UK's national standards body. Every country has one national standards body. It was established in 1901. This is a photo of the original group of participants, and they were working on the trams and the rail gauge thickness. So the importance then emerged. It was very clear that you have to have agreement, consensus on what is best practice. And that's exactly what standards do. So we are, as an organization, as a national standards body, we are creating standards for products and services and systems, and we're also providing training and assurance. In a nutshell, that's exactly what we do. It's a not-for-profit organization, and we work internationally, including the European arm of standardization, and ISO, International Standards Organization. And we do that with relevant stakeholders, businesses, governments, to develop these standards. And approximately 37,000 standards exist now. Next slide, please. Just a little bit more on committees, and maybe a little bit of an effort to encourage you to look at BSI and see if that might be right for you. There are hundreds of BSI committees in these products and services and systems, and this is how they're made up. You can see the trade associations, government bodies, education bodies, NGOs. So they all come together. We actively encourage people to submit a request to become or inquire to become a committee member. Just go to bsigroup.com, becoming a committee member, find the information there. And just to show you this also, we very much are part of the ISO International Standardization Organization in the CEN. It's a European normalization, but CEN standards, and also IAC and CENELEC. We're playing a leading role in those bodies as well. Next slide, please. What BSI does, what I do, and my colleagues work in the sort of the knowledge solutions department, we call it, where we're actually creating and revising standards. It's easiest to say that we're a facilitator. So when you bring those stakeholders together, we appoint a chair, some leadership from the sector, the industry, but we are there to provide the standardization expertise. So for instance, today, I'm giving you an opening introduction about standardization. That enables Sarah and Ruth and Ben to really focus on the subject matter. They don't need to talk about how long a draft international standard is circulated and whether it needs to be translated first, etc. BSI provide that. So we're bringing together stakeholders. You saw the groups in the yellow, those bodies. We bring them together And we provide the standardization expertise based on the directives provided by ISO and BSI and others. And we also seek this international participation. So BSI is a national standards body, but in many ways it's an international, it's very, very global because of the reach that BSI has. A very, very prominent and effective role that works with other organizations globally to make an impact. And kind of crossed my last bullet point there, but the importance of working with these other stakeholders, I can just draw attention to developing countries. We actively seek twinning arrangements with developing countries because one of the benefits of standardization is that it levels the playing field. So for instance, in this area of purpose-driven organization, not a lot of, well, I don't want to jump to any conclusions here, but from what I've seen is it's a relatively new, it's not as like quality 9001 and 14001 in environment. This is a new area that BSI is bringing to the table of ISO. It was a BSI proposal, and it was started off. We'll see in the next slide how it started off, but with PAS 808 and a standard on governance. But we bring that, we share that with, and we want people to we want to raise awareness. This is what we're doing today about the subject matter and engage with, industry, PLC, UK PLC, anybody to just say what it is and how it affects your organization, how you can embrace it. And eventually we do want to not just raise awareness, but we want to determine the impact of that. So it isn't just about creating these standards and putting it on a shelf. We want to see how they're used. And just a couple of other things. We're doing standards, new standards, as well as revising existing standards. So people will often say, what happens once the standard is published? There is an automatic arrangement whereby periodically the standard is looked at for revision if it need be. Next standard, please, or next slide, please. Thanks. I just mentioned this. I got a couple slides left here, but this one, it comes from ISO 37000 as Governance of Organizations, published in 2021. And the reason I show you this is because it took a long time for the group. This is an international group. Again, what BSI do, they'll take their national standard, very often, take their national standard and they'll put it forward for the international group. And then it does take 2 to 3 years to publish usually. To get it. But in this case, this took a long time, but it was a eureka moment when they took the value creation out of the center and replaced it with purpose. That was a big moment. And I won't say from that because I know people have been working on purpose for many years ahead of that. But then the following year, PAS 808, it was published. Now that standard, PAS 808, but it's freely available. Go to BSI or Google PAS 808, and it gives you a link for a free downloadable standard, and it will give you a lot of information. And that document is the basis for the ISO standard. I'll mention now, I haven't mentioned it here, but the standard in development is ISO 37011. Same title, Purpose-Driven Organizations, 37011, Purpose Organizations. And it's about a year off. That's much time, but it's in development. Ben, Sarah, Ruth, and many others, and I want to thank them, the committee members of G17, for the time they're putting into it, the people who developed the PAS, the people who worked on the G1, the governance, for giving their time and hard work to making all of this possible. Last slide, please, from me, is to recognize that BSI, we understand we have a unique position to take on society's biggest challenges. That first paragraph says it really well, that there is only one national standards body. And we appreciate with those 37,000 standards, and not all coming from BSI, of course, they're coming from other routes, but we are influencing international thinking, and we are there to enact action. It's implement change, positive change, to develop long-term benefit for everybody. And I think this is a perfect example of this purpose-driven organizations, of just that aspiration. So next slide, we'll introduce ourselves to the panelists. Thank you for listening to me. And now I can introduce you to Sarah Gillard, CEO of Blueprint for Better Business, and Ruth Wilkinson, Consultant Economics of Mutuality Alliance, and Ben Kellard, Fellow at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability, Leadership in CSP. So thank you all for driving this and providing your information and your expertise. Sarah, I think I'm turning over to you, please.
Great, thanks very much, David, and lovely to see Ruth and Ben. I'm relieved that you appeared from the abyss there. Otherwise, I was a bit worried I'd be on my own. Thanks so much for the intro, David. I think that's a really good articulation of why standards are necessary. I love the picture of the tram because it's got a long and illustrious history of helping organizations and countries, I guess, use standards in order to further the well-being of people and planet, and we're going to talk a lot more about that in this session. So we've got a few slides to talk you through the sort of bare bones of ISO 37011, 37011, whatever you want to call it. But we thought it'd be useful to just set the context a bit and explore why it is that a number of people on this call and others are working on a standard for purpose-driven organisations. As David said, PAS 808 provided a standard for the UK, and the ISO is intending to create a standard internationally for what a purpose-driven organisation is. So, you know, I think coming into this chat this morning, I was reflecting on the context that a lot of people are facing inside their organizations right now, looking internally and externally. And only this morning, Sundar Pichai did a 30-minute interview with BBC on iPlayer and BBC Sounds about the impact that his company, Alphabet and Google, is going to have using AI on jobs, the economy, society, the climate. I mean, that these are pivotal times, I think it's fair to say, and there's an awful lot of change and disruption going on, whether you look at it from a geopolitical perspective or a climate and environment perspective or a social and economic and health perspective. There is a huge amount of change happening, and it can often feel very confusing and like the future looks very uncertain and far less, not that it was ever predictable, but perhaps far less predictable than it's been for a long time. And I think inside organizations, it can often feel that you're just reacting to that volatility. And what I think this conversation and the ISO is trying to do is to chart a way forwards, despite all that uncertainty and volatility, to a better future. So as you can see, Ben and I have got pictures of sort of some version of utopia behind us, and Ruth's got a lovely office, but it's trying to find a way through a lot of the volatility and uncertainty of the current environment to begin to think about, well, where are we heading? Where do we want to head? And how might we get there? And what do organizations need to help create a better future? So that's really the sort of broad context that we're developing this standard in. But Ben, I know that you've got a much more kind of economically thorough and detailed analysis of where we are, how did we get here, and where might we be going. So can I hand over to you? Oh, well, we should probably introduce ourselves first, shouldn't we? Sorry, let's do that now. Sarah Gillard, I'm the CEO of a charity called Blueprint for Better Business. We were created as a result of the financial crisis, where a number of FTSE 100 CEOs at the time wanted to come together to explore how business might be a positive force for good in society. So how might we create a better society through better business? And as a charity, we do lots of things working with business and practitioners inside business, helping understand what needs to be true so that business can truly act as a force for good in society. So that's my intro, and that's why we're involved in the creation of these standards, because we think it's one of the critical enablers of organizations who are trying to create a positive impact. Ruth, shall I hand over to you, and then Ben, if you introduce yourself and then go into the slide, that would be seamless.
Thank you, Sarah, and sorry about my lack of utopian background. I attempted it, but it was merging with my hair, and I thought that was a more frightening image than it needed to be. Lovely to be here. So I'm Ruth. I'm a consultant at the Economics of Mutuality Alliance, and a bit about how we ended up here and what we do. We were born out of the internal business transformation team at Mars Inc. So you may have heard of Mars, you may have probably had a Mars bar at some point, but Mars is a 50 billion turnover family-owned business operating globally. And because it's family owned, they had this amazing potential to ask themselves some very big questions that other businesses might not be able to. And so they had this internal business transformation team, and the leaders of the business said to that team, go and answer this question for us. How much profit is enough profit? And how do we think about our impact beyond our profit? That can't be the end. Profit isn't why we exist. So what is it that we exist to do? And so the internal business transformation team went off to try and understand how much profit was enough profit and what was the impact of the business and all the different segments and brands and markets. And that spun up into an interesting partnership with the University of Oxford Saïd Business School that really explored and created this concept called economics of mutuality, which is all around creating value for the world beyond yourself, beyond the realms of your business, and finding a way to do so that allows you to create value for your business in order to reinvest in innovation and growth. And that economics mutuality became a concept that the Mars company really wanted to integrate across their work, and we worked with them to do that. And then in 2020, we spun out so that we could work with other businesses and other organizations to do the same. So still heavily involved and very supported by the Mars family, but now working across the world with other businesses to try and answer that question of how do you create value for the world and create value for yourself as an outcome of that, which is obviously why we've been drawn to standards like PAS 808 and now ISO 37011. I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit more today about what it looks like and how the standard might apply to you in your roles. And without further ado, hand over to Ben to introduce himself.
Super, thanks, Ruth. Yes, I'm Ben Kellard. I'm a fellow at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, also for the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity. And the sort of last over 25 years, I've advised senior leaders, educated and advised senior leaders on how to become more sustainable, and also shaping thought leadership on what is a sustainable purpose-led organisation. So I was on the steering committee of PAS 808, the first national standard. But this year I've been doing some independent work, looking at what is actually driving the current economy and what are alternative ways in which the economy might operate to deliver well-being. And that's been working with collaborating with a number of thought leaders from across the spectrum of new economy thinking. And I guess one of the things that we found is that the current sort of plumbing of the economy, the way it's designed, is based on classical economic thinking, which sort of is emerged out of a kind of rather unique period of human history, but unfortunately doesn't reflect the reality we're in today. And so there are kind of three main flaws with the way the current classical economy is designed. The first is it takes financial value as a proxy for well-being. So it assumes that the more you own, the happier, the more well-being you have. However, and even at the national level, so gross domestic product, as you know, all of our products and services, but Kuznets, the guy who invented it, said, do not use it as a proxy for well-being. And what do we use? As exactly as a proxy for well-being. But also that reflects at the financial services and then the organizational level, it focuses on financial value. We assume that the more money a business is making or the more money a financial institution is acquiring, the more that's contributing to well-being. The second flaw is that classical economics tends to overlook the dynamics of markets and particularly the role of elites in markets and how market concentration like we have in the modern economy has led to sort of a few oligarchs who kind of dominate sectors and the influence they have not on just those markets but also on shaping political systems. And the third kind of fundamental flaw is that it's treated the economy as separate from ecology. So it's assumed there's completely different things. So, for example, at Cambridge, the eminent economist, Professor Dasgupta, wrote the Dasgupta report for the British government and said we've made this fundamental flaw, backed up by lots of other research. And that kind of ties in with the first flaw, which is that we treat money as being the driver of well-being, not just for people, but the planet as well. So they're the kind of three main flaws. And so I think what we'll be exploring today then is that that operates at both the kind of macroeconomic level, the organizational level, maximizing profits rather than delivering well-being, and at the individual level, it ends up with, if you like, solo, isolated consumers rather than integrated citizens leading to well-being. But I think also what that means, that creates this sort of fundamental structural misalignment between economic incentives, mainstream economic incentives, and actually delivering well-being. But also I think what that does is that places organizations in this dilemma, Because on the one hand, businesses therefore have to make, particularly in the private sector, money today. If they don't, they'll go out of business pretty quickly. And often that means externalizing costs, so putting costs onto nature and society like pollution or obesity in order to maximize those sort of financial revenues. And they need to think about the future and thinking how we relevant and resilient in the future, which often relying on extraction of value from nature and society isn't sustainable and doesn't make them relevant into the future. And yet that's what they're incentivized to do. So that places organization in this difficult kind of dilemma of, so, either do I kind of, deliver those financial value, objectives today, or do I deliver, and actually reorientate my business so that it's, relevant and resilient in a, disruptive future. And that, I think, is kind of, I guess, is a lot of the reality of the businesses I'm talking to. Obviously, we'd love to hear your reflections and questions. So I think that maybe sets the scene on where we find ourselves and maybe why we need, a new standard. But yeah, Sarah and Ruth, I'd be love to sort of, hear your reflections on the standard, and why we need it.
Thanks, Ben. And as you said, we are hoping for questions during this session. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat or in the questions box and they'll come through to us. We do have some dedicated time for questions at the end, but it would be probably much better and more conversational if the questions came throughout and we were able to respond to them in real time. So yeah, please put them in the chat. I think you both gave a really great articulation of where we're at now and maybe some of the assumptions that have driven progress and growth and prosperity across this country and the world. But it was based on a set of assumptions around, as Ben said, the difference between the economy and ecology and some of the fundamental resources, including societal cohesion and trust and human health and well-being, that all of that sort of economic focus relied upon. And that some of the more existential challenges that we're now looking at in terms of whether it's environmental health or human health and well-being or inequality and what that's doing to society, it appears to be the very definition of unsustainable, in that it won't survive forever because the sort of fundamental assumptions are just breaking down or being challenged or being seen as irrelevant as conditions change. So, for many of the leaders and businesses that we speak to, it feels like we're in this sort of transition period from one set of assumptions to perhaps a new one or many new ones that are not yet fully developed, but they're emerging. So there's sort of moment where lots of different future scenarios are possible. And that means that we have an opportunity to intentionally create some of the underpinning assumptions that will create the new economy or the new society or the new way that business shows up. And that's obviously very exciting, but also massive responsibility and a lot of creates a lot of challenge. And one of the things that we've been sort of reflecting on and talking to various CEOs about is that has created a sort of political, cultural and financial set of circumstances, which is all of the sort of uncertainty and polarization and politicization that you no doubt dealing with in your day-to-day lives, and a sense that it can't be down to an individual to decide what a better future looks like. That doesn't feel legitimate, doesn't drive accountability, it's not very transparent, but that we lack a kind of common narrative around what are the important fundamentals that we're trying to achieve here in terms of creating a future where people flourish and the planet is healthy. We just haven't got a shared language or a common understanding, and that makes it very difficult if you're leading a business to sort of orientate in a direction without it feeling like you're plucking things out of the air in terms of what you think might be a good future, and that feels like a very uncertain place to be. And therefore you sort of revert to this short term, well, let's just focus on the financials because we can measure it. And that might be what some of your stakeholders are calling for, and perhaps that feels like an easier place to be. And certainly when I look at the context right now, particularly over the past year, it has felt like many organizations have dialed back on their explicit commitments to whether it's sustainability targets or DEI targets or talking about their purpose or whatever else, because it feels like such a volatile environment. And so there is perhaps a perception that silence is a safe bet right now. Interestingly, and I just put this out there because I think there's a counter narrative to that, which is that HBR and Forbes and Bain all did separate studies over the past month looking at what organizations are actually doing. And broadly, 10 to 15% of big global organizations have pulled back on their environmental or sustainability or DEI goals because of direct pressure. About 50 to 60% are actually carrying on, but just staying silent because they fundamentally can see that it's making them a stronger business, but they lack the language to be able to talk about it in ways that kind of sort of be understood by all their stakeholders. And about 30% of organizations are actually going faster and doubling down because they can see the strategic advantage in thinking in this way, but again, aren't talking about it because they don't have a language. And I think coming back to the standard, I think one of the massive positives for having an international standard is it gives organizations a common language to be able to say, here is the document that we're using to guide where we're heading. And that can attract investment, collaboration, strategic partnerships, innovation, all of the positives of this sort of way of thinking. Because at the moment, the silence is not neutral. It's creating unintended negative outcomes. So it's one of the reasons why I think the standard is much needed, and it's extremely timely because we're in this sort of weird in-between paradigms moment where something that helps us find common ground would be super useful. But Ruth, yeah, what are your perspectives from what you've seen from the outside world?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just the message there that people might be individually seeing what is happening and the challenges that we're facing in a personal, in an organizational and at a global level feels incredibly in tension with the way we know how to behave and how to act and how to make decisions. And there is no clear guidebook to how to make that shift away from the learning that we've always held, the assumptions that we hold, and the way that we've built our economy and our businesses and organizations within that. And that really is what ISO 37011 is aiming to create, is that shared understanding and a clarity of language and consensus building. Not just having a standard itself is the answer, but actually the way that we create the standard through global consensus building is part of the journey to helping define what that path might be. It won't look the same. In fact, it will look unique for every single individual and organization that is taking that standard into practice. And actually, I've seen a question in the chat, which is that is the standard intended for organizations or SMEs, or is it really applicable to all sectors? Yes, it's almost applicable to anybody and everybody in a collective, because and I'll explain a little bit why in a second and how, when I talk you through what's in it and what it aims to set out, and hopefully that will then become clear, because it is possible for all of us to tackle our worldviews and assumptions about how we act and how we come together collectively and how we organize our economy. And so we've all got an opportunity to do that and a challenge to do that. And so ISO 37011 does set that out at a really kind of big picture level. What will be the interesting challenge then is how you take the thinking in ISO 37000 and apply it to your organization, and there will be a unique journey to go on to do that. But I'll explain a bit more about what that looks like in a second. And I think just to set out what we see as the initial kind of shift that might be emerging, and that, Sarah, your stats on what is happening is really heartening to an extent, about what might be emerging and where that might be taking us. But before I dive into some slides and what ISO 37011 sets out, was there any further reflections from either you, Ben or Sarah, on what we might be seeing today and how ISO 37000 might respond to it?
No, should we dive into it, and then
let's dive in.
We could have a shared understanding of what it is we're talking about, and then hopefully the questions will come through as well. I see there's a question on shareholder primacy, which I think we should come to perhaps after you've gone through the standard.
Yes, absolutely. So David, could you take me on to the slide that's titled The Shift, which is probably the next one? Yes, great. So this is really setting out what we just talked about, but just to put it on the screen in some text about where organizations might be today and what we're seeing as the kind of dominant shareholder primacy, and where we might see the shift happening. And I think the reason that we think that organizations have such an important role to play, not least because of what we've set out, but that organizations are our chosen tool as a society to innovate. So really, the only way that we are going to solve the problems that we are facing is if organizations innovate for them. And the only way that organizations will be able to innovate for these problems is if it is valuable to them to do so. And so an economy that we want to create and that we need to create is one where organizations have kind of just value return for the innovation that they are driving to solving the problems of our time. And leaders of organizations around the world are recognizing this and refocusing their organizations towards the direct contribution to long-term well-being for all, with financial performance as a critical means through which they deliver impact. So where we might see the shift coming from is organizations where financial health is the primary focus. And what's important in this is that they might have corporate social responsibility programs or have considered externalities, but they are always tangential to core activities. So if you're thinking about your organization or organizations you've worked in, you might recognize that there's some significant work going on in mitigating negative impact, delivering social responsibility, and recognizing the negative externalities. All of that is incredibly important and very valuable. But the shift that we're looking to see, and that we are starting to see, is organizations who are reorienting themselves around making their optimal strategic contribution to long-term well-being of people and planet through their core business or organizational activities. And obviously that represents potentially a bigger shift for profit-making organizations for whom their core business activities is what is maximizing profit. And then they turn that profit into some positive good elsewhere, maybe, or maybe not, it depends. But what we're saying is that there is a potential and an opportunity for those organizations to actually innovate for solving problems of people and planet, specific problems of people and planet that they are best placed to solve, and profit is a vital outcome of doing that. So that is the definition on the right-hand side there of what we mean by purpose-driven organization. And it does look slightly different depending on what kind of organization you are, whether you're a government, whether you're a non-profit, whether you're an institution, or whether you're a profit-making business. And then if we head on to the next slide, we've got a little bit about what does it take to be a purpose-led organization. And this is really set out in the opening introduction of ISO 37011, as well as other standards like PAS 828. So you can have a look at this as well here. Very simply put, there are three core elements to being a purpose-led organization. The first is purpose, so clarity over the value you can generate for long-term well-being of all people and planet, of which profit is a vital outcome. So that is that optimal strategic contribution, the specific problems of people and planet you can solve because of your resources, your capabilities, your ambition, your values. There'll be multiple factors that make up what it is that you are most able to create value for. Then the second element is the parameters. So that's what you need to protect in the delivery of your value generation. And this is really where we think about, we might pursue our purpose with a single-minded passion, but actually in doing so, we might create unintended negative consequences on the way. So there are important things that we need to protect. Because ultimately, if we're driving towards solving one problem and another organization is driving towards solving another, but we're both harming each other in the process, we're creating further problems. And so the parameters are the guardrails through which we will behave and make decisions to optimize our ability to generate value while protecting the other value that is important for long-term well-being of all people and planet. And that is where your negative externalities, your sustainability strategies that really think about where you might be creating negative impact and reducing that would come in. And then lastly, to bring the two together is the strategy, which is essentially how are you going to deliver your purpose within your parameters. So that is the action that you want to take and the ways that you can explore and work with your stakeholders and ecosystems to do that. And this really builds into what Dave was saying earlier, which is around why is ISO 37011 considered a governance standard? And that is because it sets out what is purpose-driven organizations, and it sets out what needs to be embedded in the governance of the organization, which is the decision-making and operational head of the organization in order to make this happen. And that is because it's so deeply embedded. So heading into the next slide, let's think about how ISO 37011 helps us achieve this. So these are just some of the things. There's lots that we could talk about with what ISO 37011 offers us, but to summarize some of the key things, helps set out what organizational purpose means, helps you think about what an organizational purpose might look like for you. So it gives some parameters, some ideas, and some suggestions of ways that you could explore doing that. It helps create a clear frame for decision making. Because when you have a purpose and you're clear on the parameters through which you want to deliver your purpose, then you have a clear frame through which to make any decision about the direction of travel for your organization. It helps you think about what worldviews underpin your organization, because that is one of the kind of, as we talked about, the assumptions that we've all been operating on have led to where we are today. And so if we can help us rethink and look at what our worldviews are, we can understand what is it that's underpinning how we run our organization, which surfaces some of the ways that we might need to evolve or change. It helps you think through some of the big issues that might represent opportunities or constraints for innovation. And constraints are the mother of innovation, so both are great to be able to explore as part of the exploring of the standard. It helps think through the benefits of becoming purpose-driven, and we've talked about this already, but creating that shared language, which could be used not only within your organization, not only with yourself, but also with the wider world and your ecosystem. So diving into the next slide, and I've got a couple more slides on what's in ISO 37011, then we'll open up to some how this might kind of come to life for you in your roles. I just talked about governance being a really important way, and in fact, actually the most important way to operate your organization with a purpose-led lens. When we think about purpose, and often when I introduce myself and talk to people who've not really come across maybe purpose before, it's often considered a slogan. People will often share a purpose statement. And that is great. It's really important to be able to articulate what your purpose is, but it definitely doesn't end there. And so for purpose to be lived and acted upon in an organization, it's about how you operate, how you make decisions, and checking that the way you're operating your organization is in line with the way you say you're operating your organization. And that is fundamentally governance. And so while becoming purpose-driven invites a role for everyone and anyone in an organization, there is a critical element that needs to be overseen, which is the governance. And that is usually overseen by a governing body of some nature, depending on the type of organization. And that is why ISO 37011 is structured through the governance lens, thinking about both the three elements of governance: direction, which is the ultimate goal of your organization; oversight, so ensuring what happens within the organization is in line with the ultimate goal and the parameters; and then accountability, so being able to be answerable, that you are delivering your direction, using the information gathered in oversight to be answerable for that commitment and that responsibility. So the three elements of governance are applied through ISO 37011. And within the standard, there is 8 principles. So if we flick to the next slide, this will show you how the 8 principles bring to life both what you need to be purpose-driven. We talked about a purpose, parameters, and a strategy, through the 3 layers of governance. So there's 8 principles, 6 of which are in the direction section of the governance framing. So these include things like these are the principles that you would need to adopt to become purpose-led. So looking through there, you can see that those principles look like committing to the ultimate purpose, the meta purpose, establishing an organizational purpose, establishing decision-making parameters, establishing an organizational purpose statement, establishing organizational governance strategy, and embedding the organizational direction. And you'll hopefully recognize all 6 of those speak to what I talked about in terms of the purpose, the parameters, and the strategy. And then within each of these in ISO 37011, there's more information about what that might look like, how that might feel, and what might be considered as part of that, what is important and critical to consider as part of that, so that you can hold yourself to what those definitions and what that standard means. And then the last 2 principles are around how do you oversee and hold yourself to account. And so that is a very high-level summary of a very big standard at the moment, and that it is in draft form and is currently going through further draftings. But that is essentially what the framing will likely be of how ISO 37000 will be delivered. And my last slide before we open back up for conversation, and please do be adding questions, is how does this actually help us get to the emerging wellbeing economy? I think we've probably talked through these in detail, but just to reiterate now that you've kind of heard a bit more about what's actually in ISO 37011, we've talked about at the macro level, we're all operating within a system that is working to embed and retain what we do today. And that is going to result in the outcomes that we are seeing today, the degradation of our natural assets and resources, and deeper inequities amongst our people. And so at a macro level, ISO 37011 will provide us shared language and clarity through which we can more effectively collaborate within our system and ecosystems, and be clear what we demand from governments and institutions. Because if we can be clear and we can be united about what we need to change from the organizations that oversee us collectively, then we will be much more likely to have an impact. At a meso level, it's certainly going to provide us guidance in organizations to help us design organizations that are fit for a future that doesn't look like the past. And at a micro level, for me, I think it provided huge clarity of what kind of work I want to do and what I bring to my work, how I want to do it, and holding myself to account for it. because with all of these things, it's very easy to fall back into the way we've always done things. And so holding ourselves to account at a micro level is also a potential use of ISO 37011. But there are many, many more. And I'd now like to finish the slide section of the webinar, and we can open for questions and talk about it. And to kick the conversation started, I'd be interested to hear reflections from Ben and Sarah about how you think ISO 37011 could apply to the challenges that we're facing today.
Thanks, Ruth. I think
you've got this, because they've been channeled for both Ruth and Ben and yourself. You can see the questions. So Sarah, if you want to continue leading the discussion, thank you.
I can do that. That's totally fine. I'll compare. Thanks, Ruth. That was you've pithily summarised what is currently a very long document, and I should reiterate, this is currently under development at the moment. So there'll be opportunities for public consultation in the spring next year, and at the end of the webinar, we'll sort of give you a indication of how you might choose to get involved when it becomes open for public consultation. But it's a process that's trying to get, you know, something like 170 countries to agree to this, so that the opportunity for creating a shared language is really significant. And I think no matter how it's framed, this sort of idea that the future does not look like the past, and that if you are an organization that intends to be around in the future, you're going to have to look at some of the sort of underlying assumptions that have, you know, maybe served you well for a long time, but are not relevant in the current context, and really think about, okay, well, how am I going to contribute to being part of the solution or the positive impact in our changing world? And how am I going to try and minimize the extent to which I'm creating a negative impact in our changing world? Because that's the way to be relevant and resilient and attract investment and talent, all the rest of it. So at a really kind of basic level, I think lots of people and organizations are feeling this moment. And I do think the ISO, like you say, can operate on many levels in helping people find a way forward that will begin to create more of a movement and a shared language. And we've got a number of questions that I'll kind of bunch up. But Ben, have you got any kind of immediate reflections on Ruth's presentation?
No, I think maybe the one thing I'd add is picking up on this point about the risk of what I call the continuity bias, that we think the future will be like the past. We know all the data telling us it won't be, because we're facing into systemic cascading potential crises, because we've created these enormous liabilities as a result of our economic model, which is now undermining civilization. And that's not good news for business. And as you say, a lot of businesses realize it's undermining their whole business model. But that is the reality we're in because of these flaws in the economic model. And I think that means, therefore, that businesses are left in that dilemma of, well, how do I navigate between the future of the business that's going to be viable in the future and you know, pay the kind of shareholders today? And I think that's where the standard comes in, because it becomes that North Star to say, well, to avoid that continuity bias, because then if we're just judging ourselves by peers or the past, we're toast. So actually, it's like, how can we navigate? That's where the standard, I think, agreed, comes in. And it's not just that it helps to identify potential liabilities businesses are carrying, you know, whether that's you've got a food business reliant on destroying soil health or creating obesity, but also you're leaving value on the table, right? You know, and I think just to maybe pick off one or two of the questions that are emerging is, you know, I was at the B Corp or the B Lab, who governed B Corp's 10th anniversary last week, and I'd really encourage people to look at their report, which shows that B Corps are outperforming their peers, you know, and they're creating that value. For example, Omni, they make dog food or pet food, which is from vegetable-based proteins, and actually better for the dog's health. It's better for the environment. You know, again, it's like this smart business. They're growing really rapidly. They're attracting talent, you know, because they can see the kind of through that kind of purpose lens how we're meeting society's real needs. So I think there's all part of that. And I think also the idea was the standard, of course, is that we're converging all of those great thinking, whether that's B Corp, business in the community, Forum for the Future, Future Fit framework, the list goes on. It's like, what is all that common sort of blueprint of, you know, great business? That's what the standard is looking to capture. And we do feel that it's designed for any sector, so public and private, small businesses, large businesses, and their entry point is likely to vary, you know, whether they're either starting out thinking, what is all this sustainability stuff, through to, I've got a strategy, how do I stress test it and how I'm implementing it, through to those real leaders who are pioneering, looking to shape markets to win in with sustainable solutions. And I think for any of those entry points, the standard's really, really relevant. So maybe just add those, we maybe start to look at some of the other questions.
Great, thank you.
I was just going
Ruth,
to add
yeah.
one thing that I didn't mention that I should have done, and I think Ben's just alluded to it as well. The standard is not expected to be I don't know what you'd call it, a certification, that's it. It's not expected to be a certification standard. It's expected
right.
to be a management guidance standard. So just to be explicitly clear about what that means, it will not be possible to stamp ISO 37011 on your wall or your products, or it's not a standard that you will be able to comply or be certified against. And the reason being is that it is a guide. It is best placed and most applicable and meaningful as a guide, because what it sets out is a set of principles that you can adopt and will be a unique journey. There will be no way for someone to come and say, yes, you have correctly applied these principles perfectly, tick. It will be considered, the quality of the conversation will be just as important as the outcome. And so certifying against that feels wrong and counterintuitive to what we're trying to achieve here. But it will be possible to hold yourself to account for it and to hold others to account for it too, but through a qualitative conversational way of doing so, with some key elements that will be very critical. So I noticed there's a question about measurement. The standard itself is unlikely to set out explicitly how you would measure your performance for that, but it will point you in the right direction, because it will set out what is important for you to have as a purpose-driven organization, and therefore what you need to hold yourself to account to doing and collect data on will be pointed to, but it will be specific and different for you depending on the kind of organization that you are. And maybe there will be an evolution and an iteration of that. But B Corp is obviously a certification where you can go through a process and be certified. So they do offer and represent different things in the system, but complementary things completely. And thinking through ISO 37011 will really help you take on a B Corp certification.
Yeah. Great. So I think that's probably covered 2 or 3 of the questions. So one of the questions was, is this applicable to all organizations? And I think the answer is yes, because it's a guidance document. And as you said, Ruth, you're able to take it and apply it to your organization. Is it in competition or in sort of harmony with B Corp? Harmony. So there are many frameworks and guidance documents out there, and I think, as Ben said, what this is trying to do is provide a common language, and then there are obviously different ways into it and different methodologies that you can use, but this guidance standard will give you a solid place to stand. And Ben, you began to touch on one of the questions there around what about areas where shareholder primacy or fiduciary duty may sort of point in a different direction. And I think this points to the sort of the old paradigm where sort of profit and purpose were assumed to be intention, and that there was a zero-sum relationship between those two, more of one is less of the other. And I think, what we're collectively seeing is those organizations who have this mindset and this way of operating are tending to do better in a context of volatility and uncertainty in the VUCA world that somebody else mentioned in the conversation. So I think the assumed trade-off is no longer true, and actually there's good data demonstrating that this is the way of building strong businesses that are going to be resilient in the future. And anything you want to add to those sort of top line questions, and then I can dive a bit deeper into some of the more detailed ones.
Sure, and I think just briefly, because even where it's often the default is around shareholder primacy, the reality is that those director codes are saying directors are there to work in the interest of the long-term interests of the business. That's their role, and the shares of which happen to be owned by shareholders. So actually their primary role is the long-term interest of the business. I think the ISO standard helps them navigate exactly that. So I think if they are defaulting, where the reality is there are obviously a lot of regions who are under a lot of pressure, although again it's really dangerous to kind of stereotype investors, of course, because increasingly it depends on which kind of investors. They're increasingly under pressure to things like Task Force for Climate and Nature related disclosure, which is asking businesses to disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature and climate and what they're doing about it. There's national based assessments of economies. There's increasingly, I think, at the sector level, where investors, NGOs, regulators are asking those questions, and the big liabilities sit at and are pretty well known at that sector level. Those aren't going anywhere. So I think even for those that are primarily focused on financial value, because those externalities now those flaws are undermining those value chains and civilization in the process, there is directly impacting that financial value. So as you say, it is a false dilemma, and even for them, they are going to need to explain how they're creating value both now and into the future.
Yeah, and there was an encouraging sort of note in the chat around all of the various other ISOs or PAS standards for asset management that put purpose and sustainability at the heart of it. So I think there's a lot of kind of complementary frameworks coming out, because this recognition of the future does not look like the past, and how we're thinking about this such that the economy is actually serving the long-term well-being of people and planet is quite a common conversation. And one of the interesting questions, well, they're all interesting, but one of the particularly interesting questions is basically whose responsibility is it to challenge the current economic paradigm? And my probably slightly trite answer is, well, nature's doing it for us. Definitely the challenges are emerging, and I would say probably citizens, it is all of our responsibility to ask questions of, government, business, civil society organisations to shape how we want a future and have a sort of collective vision. But do you have more detailed answers than that? Because nature and citizens is quite high level.
Yeah, my view, I agree. I think everybody, and often they play it good at, right, like climate scientists, great at doing the science, really atrocious often at communicating it, for example. Businesses as well. I think that's the thing, is if we're going to shape markets to deliver true value, then we need businesses to lean in, to embolden regulators and create that virtuous circle as well. But I think ultimately it is politicians. I think, they're elected, and their primary role is to protect the long-term interests of their citizens, and almost universally they fail to do that. Otherwise we wouldn't be facing these existential issues. But I think what the thinking that I've been doing is that what's really critical is I think in connecting is civil society working with government to set out what are those well-being goals and that we want to achieve, and then helping to then create the right regulation, not necessarily more, to then structure and incentivize markets to bring all the innovation and investment that markets are great at to deliver those well-being economies. So it's not state control, but it is state guide rails in conjunction with civil society. And I think, let's be honest, that does mean challenging some of the kind of vested interests in markets, where there's that strong relationship between, centralized economic power shaping political power, making that more transparent and challenging that, and whose interest they're working in as part of that. So, but I think, yeah, as you say, it's that network of both, scientists, people developing the evidence, working with civil society, NGOs, but I think particularly leveraging governments to really step in and play that role, and not just leave everything to the market as they've, largely done for the last few decades.
I would completely, wholeheartedly agree, Ben, and just wanted to add a little bit as well, responding to that question, but also a couple of other questions, which are kind of, what's the entry point? How do we start to action this transition? What principles could we be guided by? And actually, I think one of the things that we can all do is start the conversation about what our worldviews and beliefs are, about what role organizations should play in society versus civil sector and public sector, and how we want to act and behave within that as people and leaders. And one of the things that we've noticed when we start to have this conversation is it's very easy for us to operate within the kind of guardrails we've always been given, and assume that people that have power over us in some way, like shareholders, don't want us to be thinking more broadly about value, or be thinking about different kinds of value we could create beyond financial value. And so often those assumptions have not played out. So often when the conversation has started, leaders are surprised and actually look to each other and say, we actually connect here on a values-based level that we weren't expecting to, because we believed, and we've been operating in this mindset that financial value is all of our driving core purposes. And when that conversation starts, it can trickle through organizations and up as well into the kind of the way that we manage our investments as an economy. And that is a conversation I think that's well worth starting, and can be started today. And using PAS 808 today and then ISO 37011 can provide a really good guiding point of what kind of conversation to initiate and how. And try to not hold your assumptions about what other people might be believing, because offering them another way and another kind of set of language to explain how they might see the value that they can bring to the world could offer them something, a change in mindset that may be incredibly beneficial.
Thanks, Ruth. And I think, we are all humans. We might call ourselves suppliers or investors or consumers or, colleagues or whatever, but we are all humans. And back to Ben and my backgrounds, and yours, Ruth, we exist in the world, in the physical world. So getting behind the assumptions and trying to collectively think about, where are we heading? Where would we intentionally like to head? What kind of future are we trying to build here? and how do we make sure that we can do that in ways that are appropriate for our organization and allow the organization to thrive as well. So, I mean, this is sort of an imagination exercise that I think the guidance will help provide some clarity and grounding to, and it's much needed. David, you've reappeared. Does that mean we've got 5 minutes left? So this is the moment, isn't it, that we hand over to you and do a masterful wrap up.
Congratulate you as panelists and as a co-power. I thought it was beautiful. The feedback will tell all that, won't it? But thank you, Ruth and Ben and Sarah. I should mention to everybody else who submitted comments, I think we got half there, but you managed to sort of touch on them as you answered questions and had your discussion. So thank you for that. People who participated, thank you very much indeed. We will do another one. The purpose of this was to raise awareness. In answering a couple of questions, it looks like the consultation for the public will be available maybe quarter two of next year. And that would usually follow a year, the actual publication of the standard, ISO 37011. And in terms of, is it going to be a lighter version? Actually, PAS 808 is a light version, as light as it gets, in terms of the content, because, to understand it, there is some reading that's going on there and some serious thinking, because it is sort of a shift in your mindset for a lot of organizations. That was discovered as we contemplated the proposal to put it to ISO. And frankly, that's why we went to a guidance. It was actually considered, despite what Ruth said. There are some brave individuals out there, Ruth, who really wanted to go for the certification. They thought it was very viable and they thought it was a way to go. But, what do you say? Prudence, we said, let's start off with this guidance, and that's enough. And that will be for organizations. But PAS 808 is very, very understandable, I believe personally, as a lay person. We did the consultations coming up. Just for last thing, the relationship with the other standards, it kind of ties in with what I said about the difficulty in getting people to participate. There's no cost to participate in the British standards, but there's no remittance either. So it's on that basis that people give their time freely to participate, and indeed in ISO level, that's even a harder commitment in many ways. And so that's what's going on at ISO. But the trick is, for asset management, I was just at a risk management, there's areas like modern slavery or any of these standards. If we want to get it from value creation at the core to purpose, who's gonna enact that? It was a question about how do you drive it away from the economic focus. It's the individuals attending those meetings. It's the people giving the comments to the people participating in those meetings. So somebody has to do that. There has to be some driver. So it's this group of people that I'm personally very, very grateful to. I think I've left you about 30 seconds each, guys. So if we can, Ruth, a 30-second closure from you, then Sarah, then Ben, then we'll call it a day.
30 seconds to say goodbye. I guess this is just the beginning of this work on the standard. It's a journey and it will not be perfect in its draft form, and nor will it be perfect when it's published, because it will be very difficult to. But it's a conversation starter, and so what I would say is please join the conversation. Please reach out to engage with these topics, see how they apply to you, and start practicing and experimenting with what it might mean to make a change in the way you talk to people, the spaces you convene, or the way you operate. See what happens. And thank you for engaging and your great questions.
Thank you, Ruth. Brilliant. Sarah?
To Harith, thank you for engaging. I think there is no silver bullet to these challenges, but I think this is a really important sort of brick in the foundations of what it is going to look like to build a better future, and will hopefully act as a bit of a beacon for governments, investors, other organizations to understand how they can play their role in shaping a better future. So it's going to take all of us. So thank you for joining this webinar, and hope it's been useful.
And thank you also, Sarah. Absolutely brilliant. Ben?
Yeah, my invitation would be whatever your sphere of control and influence, maybe starting with your sphere of control, how might, you look at the purpose, parameters and strategy that you can occupy within that, within your sphere of influence, how might you engage people in this conversation, maybe framing questions, provocations, suggestions, inviting them into this as well would be my sort of final invitation. Thank you.
All right, great. Then just a reminder to anyone listening, participants, or so please submit your feedback. In that way, you're added to a BSI list. They don't inundate you with a lot of comms, but they will make sure that you're aware of any further webinars such as this in this area. Thanks, guys. Thanks very much.